Now, the Independent Examinations Board is expected to release its matric results tomorrow morning, while the Department of Basic Education will release the National Senior Certificate results on Thursday. Let's now take a look at how the fight for equal education is going in South Africa. And we're now joined via Zoom by Merle Mansfield. She is the Program Director for Equal Education. Thank you very much for joining us, and good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, Flo. Just a correction, I'm Program Director for the Zero Dropout Campaign.
Zero Dropout Campaign, apologies to you. Merle, let's start here then. We're talking about the issue of dropout, and certainly this is something that's been quite a problem in the country, and it's been made worse, in fact, by the issue of COVID-19, and that, we found learners battling and, in fact, just, dropping out altogether. What's been your observation of the 2022 calendar year?
So it's definitely been challenging for learners to hold their grip on schooling even before COVID-19. And I think what we're seeing a lot more of in 2022, or what we saw a lot more of in 2022, was a lot of concern around the amount of time that was lost in classrooms, the access that learners had to facilitate or have facilitated education, the fact that many learners had come back into spaces where they were now in more heterogeneous classrooms, where some had access and some hadn't, and having to facilitate catch up for the loss of that time on learning. I think there was an estimate made by researchers at Stellenbosch University last year that 155 school days were lost for learners in South Africa. And that's nearly an entire school year. Yeah. And so I think the impact of that, we're definitely, going to be feeling going forward.
Yeah, and you have this new report on school dropout. What have you been able to unearth on this issue? Because, we can have all the stats that we like and talk about, the numbers and how many learners are dropping out. But at the end of it, there's an issue, and there's a root cause for what we're seeing. What have you found mostly to be at the root of this problem?
So our report this year looks at the contextual factors that contribute to dropout. And very amply, the report is named Context Counts. And so it looks at what are learners experiencing in their daily lives attending school. What is making it difficult for learners to hold grip on schooling? Because what we understand about dropout is that it's actually a process of disengagement that happens, where dropout is the last kind of eventual consequence of that process, and that there are many steps in between that process that happens to a learner that we can mitigate dropout from happening. So what we're seeing is learners, living in spaces and communities where the perception of dropout is normalized. That's one of the things, where the idea that completing school is only for some learners and not for all learners seems to be kind of largely accepted, where there is a lot of expectation around being able to walk out of school and walk into a job. The schools we visited and the report we deep dived in looks at the circumstances in the Northern Cape, where there's still very large expectations for many learners that mining opportunities would be the eventual next step for them. And so matric really isn't as important. But we're seeing how learners across the country are struggling to access post-school opportunities without that certificate. We're also seeing issues around grade repetition and support in schools. So learners who are repeating grades are struggling to really learn concepts and aren't able to master them because schools aren't able to offer them the additional support they need to learn. And so we're seeing issues around teenage pregnancy and violence and sexual violence and support for young mothers or mothering learners. We're seeing issues around, transactional sex and being able to earn income into homes and families being placed more importantly than education or completion of school. And so I think there's a number of contextual factors that learners are navigating within their daily lives that contribute to how disengaged they are from school.
Yeah, you raise the Northern Cape as one of the provinces that are concerning, but you also spoke about there's areas where you're finding that being a school dropout is actually normalized. Can you give us a fuller picture in terms of it can't just be the Northern Cape, but the types of areas, for instance, where you're finding that this is normalized, whether it is in the villages or rural areas, or where exactly are you finding this particular sort of pattern?
So the issue of school dropout is pervasive. And so there are learners who are dropping out of school across our country in every setting, in every context, in every school. And we are seeing that learners are either getting stuck in school, so they're not getting through school in an adequately easy way for them to stay in school. And we're also seeing that learners are dropping out once they have struggled to stay in school for long enough. So it's not, the problem isn't concentrated in rural areas or in impoverished areas. We're seeing that this problem is widespread. And we're seeing that there's issues of dropout across different provinces. Where the problem is acute is definitely in schools that are our no-fee schools, so our schools quintile 1 to 3, that are serving our poorer population, our most disadvantaged communities. And it makes sense if we think about the struggle through school being more difficult for those learners and having access to support being a lot more difficult for those learners. So in those spaces, often dropout becomes a lot more prevalent, but it is definitely a pervasive issue that affects, boys and girls across the country in all different contexts and settings. There's also a really
sorry to come in there. You're talking about boys and girls, and in fact, that's where I wanted to go. You're saying that the problem is, really sort of for both sexes, both boys and girls. But do you find that more so with girls? I mean, we're hearing a lot about the fact that girls are dropping out due to the fact that they're falling pregnant, for example. Is that something that you've found a lot of? Because it does, from what we've seen that it's a lot worse when it comes to girls. Or is that not what your report found?
So our report that was released last year looks at the gender specifics around dropout, and we actually found that, interestingly, boys are dropping out at a higher rate than girls within South Africa specifically. In the sub-Saharan context, so in the broader region, we're seeing that girls are dropping out at a higher rate than boys. And there are some, interesting reasons and recommendations around that, around how South Africa engages with young boys in our context and specifically in the schooling context, but also around some of the strides that were made in supporting pregnant learners by the Department of Basic Education, and a lot of policy reform around being able to bring learners back who are mothering learners. And so I think there has been that gap in the past that had been identified, and there's been work done around that. But we do see completion rates for males in our country being a lot lower than completion rates for girls within South Africa.
All right, it's been a pleasure and very informative talking to you, Merle. We certainly do appreciate your time. Let me get it right. The program director at Zero Dropout Campaign, Merle Mansfield, speaking to us there. Of course, on the back of us awaiting the matric results, which will indeed be released tomorrow then. We're still on school matters. It's